Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. Today, I want to talk about some cues that are commonly used in dance that we need to stop using. So some of these cues are problematic because they create like muscle activation or muscle balance problems in the body that are maybe then causing other issues. And I'll explain more about that as we go through. And some of them are just problematic because they are anatomically incorrect or impossible and create a lot of confusion. A lot of the cues we're going to talk about today are ones that have been traditionally used within the dance world for like so long and are probably cues that teachers heard themselves growing up, and their teachers probably used the same cues, and they've just kind of perpetuated themselves within the dance world. And if we actually stop and think about them, they don't make sense, but we continue to use them. So I really want to challenge everybody to maybe think a little bit more critically about how we are using our language and what cues we are using, and whether these cues actually make sense or whether these cues are potentially creating more issues than what they are sort of solving or what you're trying to get with these. So I'm going to go through 5 of the maybe most common ones that I hear used all the time or see dancers coming into the clinic who either have questions about these cues because they'll come in and say, my teacher always tells me XYZ, but like I have no idea what that means, or I don't know how to do that, or like I can't make that happen in my body, or what have you. And some of these cues I sort of crowdsourced from Instagram. So I threw up a story on my Instagram a little while ago and kind of asked people if they had any cues that they were used to hearing, or maybe they even used themselves if they were teachers, or ones that are like continually perpetuated. And there were definite themes that came through. So I'm going to go through my top 5 cues that we need to stop using immediately within the dance world. And some of them I've kind of grouped together because, like I said, there were common themes of the ones that I got in response to asking all of you guys on Instagram which ones you sort of found problematic or maybe just have questions about. So I'm going to get into it. Number 1, and this is kind of where the genesis of this podcast episode came from, because this is the cue that still gets used so much, and dancers all the time in the clinic are like, I don't know how to do this, and that is the cue to lift your leg from underneath. Or some people will even go as far as to say, lift your leg using your hamstring. And this cue is so problematic because it is physically impossible. And if we take a second to think about the anatomy of the hip and the leg, and specifically the hamstring muscle, we cannot lift our leg with our hamstring, especially lifting to the front or the side. If we are lifting our leg to the back in an arabesque position, that is a slightly different story. However, even in that position, our hamstring should not be the primary thing lifting our leg. I'm going to also throw in the cues of don't use your quad to lift your leg, or some people even say like don't use your hip flexor to lift your leg. So these cues kind of get thrown around as well, and I'm just lumping them all together, and we are going to break down the anatomy of why these cues are so problematic. So if we are lifting our leg, and especially to the front, because I think this is when this cue gets used the most, it maybe gets used a little bit like to the side as well if we're lifting our leg to second, but it's almost always devant where I hear people use this cue, or like dancers are being told to lift your leg from underneath. And if we think about the anatomy surrounding the leg and the hip joint, especially if we are lifting our leg to the front, that movement that is happening there is hip flexion. So we are flexing our hip to the front. And muscles that can create that movement, or that our hip flexor muscles, are the group of muscles called our hip flexors. But that's a group of muscles and is broken down into, we have our iliacus, we have our psoas, we commonly often call that muscle our iliopsoas. We have our tensor fascia lata, so TFL is a hip flexor muscle, and we have our quad muscles as well that cross the hip joint and act as hip flexors. So if we want to be able to flex our hip or lift our leg to the front, we need to be able to use our hip flexors to do it. Now, I know why teachers use this cue, and it is to create a bit of a visualization for dancers and a feeling of maybe not like gripping too much through the front of the leg or overusing their quads and then not stabilizing enough through their core or using their psoas enough and actually accessing the deeper hip flexors. So I understand, excuse me, I understand what teachers are trying to get at with this cue, but it is so problematic because it's like anatomically impossible. So if we want to use cues to get at that sort of those issues or like get those feelings, we're far better off using cues that are not anatomically based, especially if the anatomical cue is incorrect. And I may actually in the future do a podcast episode specifically about this, but there is a lot of research around using cues that are internal to the body. So things that are using more like anatomical landmarks. So whether that is like muscles or bone alignment or things like that, versus using external cues. So those would be cues. So say we're lifting our leg, instead of saying, lift your leg from underneath, you might say, imagine your foot floating up towards the ceiling or something like that. So the cue becomes external to the body. The cue becomes the ceiling or the sky or whatever it is that you're using as that cue. And there is a lot of research to support using external cueing over internal cueing for enhanced performance and enhanced outcomes. And like I said, maybe in the future, I'll do an entire podcast episode on that because it's actually really, really interesting research. But regardless of that, whether we're using internal or external cues, if we are using internal cues, they need to be anatomically correct. Dancers nowadays have way more knowledge of anatomy and how their body works than we maybe did in the past. And so when you're using like incorrect anatomical cueing, they're so confused by it. Dancers know that their hamstring is down the back of their leg. And so when they're trying to lift their leg to the front, they literally can't figure out how they're supposed to be engaging that. And we end up with all sorts of issues of the dancer then sort of like trying to create a co-contraction around the leg or all these things that become problematic because they fundamentally know where their hamstring is, but they cannot figure out how to lift their leg with using that hamstring. And that is because it's anatomically impossible to do that, but they're trying to literally follow that cue. So we need to be really careful about using cues that are anatomically based, especially if they're incorrectly anatomically based. So we need to be careful using anatomical cues even if they're being used correctly, but especially when they are being used incorrectly. So that whole concept of lift your leg from underneath, or don't use your quad to lift your leg, or don't use your hip flexor to lift your leg, that needs to end. We need to be able to tell dancers and like have dancers appreciate that their hip flexor is the most powerful muscle for them to lift their leg. And if they want to increase their extension height and their ability to hold their leg in any sort of extension, but especially if we're going to Vent or Alice Acon, that they need to have strength in that hip flexor muscle. And I think this isn't exactly what I was talking about in terms of cueing, but I think we often also see a lot of weakness in the hip flexors because dancers are so afraid to use it because these cues have been sort of drilled into them. And so they never work on strengthening it. And if we want them to be able to improve their extension and improve their leg height, they need really, really, really strong psoas and really strong hip flexors. And so it's one of the things that we see come up and people come in and say, oh, I really want to work on my extension height. And the way to do that is by strengthening these muscles, but then they're fearful of doing that because they've been told, oh, you don't want to use those muscles. We don't want those muscles to be like over-recruited or bulky or things like that. So number one cue to get rid of, stop using, lift your leg from underneath, or lift your leg using your hamstring, or whatever variation of that you hear in class. Second cue that we need to stop using, and again, because it is anatomically incorrect, is this cue of shoulder blades down and back. Or sometimes you'll hear people say, put your shoulder blades in your back pocket. So this idea of like tucking the shoulder blades down and back. Kind of along with this, and it's a little tiny bit different, but it's sort of in the same vein, is the cue, and this is one that somebody contributed on Instagram, is that cue of lifting your arms with your back. All of these cues are massively confusing to dancers. So I'm going to go back to the shoulder blades down and back one first and explain why that one's so problematic. And then we'll come back and kind of talk a bit about the lifting your arms with your back, because that one's maybe a little bit more of a visual than like truly anatomically incorrect, but it's still a confusing cue for dancers. So shoulder blades down and back. And this cue, I think, is given especially or mostly when dancers have their arms overhead. So if their arms are up in fifth position or they're doing anything, arms reaching up. When we lift our arms over our head, some of that movement that happens, we call that movement elevation. So as our arm comes up into elevation, and that can be coming forwards and up into elevation, or it can be coming sideways and up into elevation. It doesn't matter how our arm gets there. So coming forwards, we might be coming through first position and then up to fifth, or coming from the side, we'd be coming from second position and then up to fifth. Regardless, we call that movement elevation. When we elevate our arms, movement happens at the shoulder joint, and some of that movement happens from the glenohumeral joint. So that's the arm bone connecting into the socket on the side of your shoulder blade. And about 2/3 of that movement potentially comes from that joint, the shoulder joint itself. The rest of that movement of getting our arms up into an elevated position comes from our shoulder blade or our scapula moving on our rib cage. So our shoulder blades, we can move them around. Everybody knows they can shrug their shoulder blades up or that type of thing. And when we elevate our arms over our head, about 1/3 of the movement that's occurring is coming from that shoulder blade sliding along our rib cage. The direction that your shoulder blade has to slide in order to get your arm up over your head is actually a upward rotation direction. So if you imagine your shoulder blade is kind of like triangular shaped, and when we have our arms kind of hanging at our side, or if our arms are just down, the point of that triangle, or one of the points, the bottom point, kind of points like directly to the floor. And then we have the top sort of part of the triangle is pretty horizontal, like roughly horizontal to the ground. It's a little bit sloped up, but in most people, it's going to be relatively horizontal. As we bring our arm up to elevation, that bottom tip of the triangle slides out sideways and rotates upwards. So that top edge of the triangle actually ends up in a like upwardly sloped or upwardly slanted position. And the degree of that's going to depend on individual people's anatomies, but in your head, just for a visualization, imagine that triangle kind of rotating upwards roughly 45 degrees or so. There's a lot of reasons why this needs to happen, but one of the biggest reasons is the socket for our shoulder joint is attached to our scapula or our shoulder blade. It's part of the shoulder blade. And it's a little like kind of dish-shaped socket. So the shoulder's a ball and socket joint, but the socket's kind of dish-shaped. It looks like a little like teacup saucer almost. And if we do not allow that shoulder blade to upwardly rotate, that socket stays way too vertically oriented. So it almost, if our shoulder blade is staying kind of put or our shoulder blade is being pulled down, that socket's going to stay really vertically oriented. And that becomes problematic because it's not very stable in that position. If we allow that shoulder blade to upwardly rotate, that little saucer, the socket, rotates upwards, so you can then imagine our little teacup saucer or whatever it is facing more towards the sky or more towards the ceiling. And that creates a much better shelf for our shoulder or our humerus, the ball part of the ball and socket joint, to sit in, and is a much more stable position in through there. So I know that's a lot of anatomy. If you can't visualize any of that, don't worry. But that is the reason why this shoulder blades down and back cue is so problematic, because it's actually creating the exact opposite movement of what should actually be happening kinematically with those movements in the body as we bring our arms up. In order to get our arms fully up over our heads, we need to allow that upward rotation to happen. And this cue becomes, I would say, even more problematic because the people who are given this cue are the people who tend to let their shoulders really elevate kind of towards their ears. And so teachers, seeing that, you don't want the shoulders like really shrugged and really elevated towards the ears. So they try and cue these dancers to pull their shoulder blades down and back, but it's creating way more restriction of movement and tension in that shoulder elevation position. So if we need at least 1/3 of that movement to come from scapular movement, and we're not allowing that to happen, we're actually limiting how much elevation these dancers have. And these dancers are often the ones that are maybe already slightly more restricted in elevation. So we actually need to really allow them to upwardly rotate their shoulder blade in those positions. And it is not a true shrug of the shoulder blade, because that's when we end up with like shoulders sort of near our ears. It is this upward rotation. They need to be able to feel that the shoulder blade can kind of slide out to the side a little bit and then upwardly rotate. It's almost like a little bit of like a swinging action that happens. And in that position, they can then elevate their arms fully over their head without their shoulders ending up right up near their ears, but also with allowing the proper biomechanics of the shoulder joint to happen. If we have dancers who are doing a lot of loaded overhead movement, these cues become even different, because in those positions, it's even more important for them to make sure that they're getting true upward rotation. And so again, we cue this like shoulder blades down and back, but actually we want our shoulder blades to elevate and to be shrugged up in those positions. So what I mean by loaded is if people were doing like handstands or things like that, where they're bearing weight through their arms in an overhead position. So obviously in the case of a handstand, they're inverted, but it's still the same relative arms overhead. So I'm not going to get into the biomechanics of that right now, because it is a little bit more complicated. But if we're thinking about dancers, so there is no load going through their arm, we don't necessarily want their shoulders elevated up near their ears, but we do absolutely need to allow that upward rotation to happen. And so this down and back cue for their shoulder blades is anatomically and biomechanically incorrect, and we should not be promoting it. And we often see all sorts of other issues crop up from this, where dancers are then really gripping with their lats like crazy. And they'll end up with other kind of movement restrictions that are sort of a result of this compensation of them having this kind of incorrect biomechanical pattern happening when their arms are overhead. Just to touch super briefly on that sort of lift your arms from your back cue. Again, I absolutely know where that cue is coming from. And again, it's sort of like that visual of wanting to support the arms in through there, because our arms, again, are attached to our shoulder blade, and our shoulder blade attaches to our back via muscles. So this cue, it's not so much that it's like anatomically incorrect, because in order for us to lift your arms, we do need to activate and be supporting those muscles from our like scapular stabilizers or our shoulder blade stabilizers. And those can be seen as like back muscles. This cue is just so confusing for dancers, because they don't understand that unless you have, advanced level dancers where you've done a lot of anatomy and they really understand the anatomy of the shoulder girdle and like the shoulder blade and all of that. This cue doesn't make any sense to them, because they're thinking, hey, here's my arm. What are you talking about my back? Like, they don't understand those connections between that. So like I said, it's not that this cue is so problematic from an anatomical perspective. It's just really, really confusing. And so, if you are really working on teaching anatomy to your more advanced level dancers, then maybe these cues start to make a bit more sense. But I would really caution away from those cues with kind of more like lower levels, like junior, intermediate type dancers, or any dancer who really hasn't done any anatomy and doesn't know what we're talking about. So that's cue number 2 to stay away from is shoulder blades down and back, or shoulder blades in your back pocket. Number 3, we're going to move on to a turnout cue, and this is the cue of turning out from your inner thigh. And we hear this cue a lot. And in fact, when I do like turnout workshops and stuff with dancers, we cover the anatomy of turnout and the like muscles and all of that kind of stuff. And if I ask dancers like, what are the muscles that you use for turnout? The number one muscle that dancers will tell me in workshops is their inner thigh. And I think the reason for that is because they hear this cue all the time. Turn out from your inner thigh, use your inner thigh to hold your turnout, all of those types of cues in through there. And again, this cue is problematic because it creates a little bit of sort of non-optimal movement patterns, I would say. And again, this comes down to like understanding and knowing our anatomy, especially for turnout. So in our body, and we're just going to talk about turnout that comes from our hip right now. So turnout is a combination of movement that comes from the hip, but there's also some contributions from like the knee and the foot and ankles, sort of lower limbs. But right now we're just going to talk about the hip. If you want to learn more about like turnout anatomy specifically, or like the biomechanics and stuff of turnout, I will link the turnout podcast episode in the show notes here. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, go back, check out that episode. But essentially, when we talk about turnout coming from our hip, we have 2 groups of turnout muscles. So we have what is called our primary turnout muscles, and we have secondary turnout muscles. Our primary turnout muscles are a group of 6 muscles. They're all fairly small, and they're located deep within the hip, and their only job essentially is to create external rotation at the hip joint, or turnout, as you will. So that's sort of externally rotating your hip. They don't have other functions in the body. So that's why they are called primary turnout muscles. Their main job, and essentially their only job, is to externally rotate or turn out that hip, the hip at the hip socket. Our secondary turnout muscles are muscles that can produce some external rotation, but they have another primary job. So their other primary job, and an example, for instance, would be like our glute muscles, and especially like gluteus medius. Glutes can be an external rotator because of how they act on the hip joint, but their primary job is actually hip extension. Our inner thighs some of our inner thighs can produce a little bit of that external rotation in certain positions. So not necessarily even in all positions, but in certain positions. But their primary job is to be a hip adductor. That means bringing your hip like in towards the midline of your body. So the easiest visualization for that would be if you were like, squeezing a ball or squeezing something in between your knees. So really like using your inner thighs to squeeze inwards. That is hip adduction. And that is our inner thighs' primary job. So yes, they can produce a tiny bit of turnout in certain positions, in certain ranges of motion, but that is not their primary role. And so this cue of turning out from your inner thigh confuses dancers because that shouldn't be primarily where we're initiating our turnout from. But again, it's this cue that I think is given because it creates almost like a feeling or something, or like teachers are using it to try and create a feeling that I understand to some degree, but when we like break it down more literally, it just doesn't make any sense because dancers are like, but I can't actually like hold my turnout or create my turnout with that inner thigh in through there. So if we are looking for cues that maybe create a similar type of feeling or visualization, we want to try and pick something that's not so anatomically linked. So sometimes you'll hear teachers using cueing of, imagining your leg has like candy cane stripes, like those kind of spiral or barbershop pole kind of stripes, and you're trying to like rotate those or things like that are a little bit more abstract in that they're not such an anatomically muscle cued like cue that is being given. Because like I said, our primary turnout muscles should be the muscles that we're cueing turnout from if we're using anatomical cues, but we potentially don't even necessarily want to be using anatomical cues. So turning out your leg from your inner thigh is a cue that needs to go and we need to stop using. Number 4, And this kind of goes along with a few other cues, but the one that got sent to me the most by like quite a few different people is this cue of knitting your ribs down and together, or knitting your ribs together, knitting your ribs down. So this cue gets used when we have people who are allowing the front of their rib cage mostly. So the dancers you'll see is sort of allowing that front of the rib cage to kind of flare open a little bit, or maybe they're going into a little bit of extension through their thoracic spine or even through their lumbar spine. And so really it's kind of a postural cue that's being used to try and sort of quote unquote fix this posture and create a little bit more of a neutral spinal alignment in through there. This cue is super problematic because it creates some really, really dysfunctional movement patterns and muscle recruitment patterns. So when we tell dancers, and especially young dancers, to knit their ribs together or to like pull their ribs down or that type of cueing, we are often encouraging them to really, really brace and over-recruit, especially through their oblique muscles. And so you'll see them almost like clamp down on like their obliques to try and control those ribs in through there. And dancers, even without this cue, are already often very over-dominant through their oblique muscles. They're often really gripping through those obliques, and this cue just feeds into that movement pattern. And this movement pattern is problematic because of how the ribs attach into the spine and the ribs' job and role in allowing especially rotation type movements and things like that to happen in the thoracic spine. But it's also probably more so problematic because it really alters dancers' breathing patterns. And again, dancers already, depending on what styles of dance they're doing and that type of thing, already maybe have slightly altered or sort of, I don't want to use the word dysfunctional because like if we're breathing and we're staying alive. So like it's serving a function, but we have dancers who will use a lot of sort of like bracing or like non-optimal breathing patterns. And this cue just feeds into that so much, where dancers will just like be so over dominant in their obliques and really alter their ability to have a more regulated breathing pattern. So a lot of dancers really struggle to do any sort of like diaphragmatic breathing because they're so held and so gripped within those muscles in through there. So again, this cue I think is used because teachers are trying to create a little bit more of a neutral spinal alignment, and the rib cage, like I said, is attached to the spine. And so they use the ribs as a way of cueing that. But we really need to think about, are there other ways that we can cue this spinal alignment we're looking for, this neutral spine, that is not creating these like suboptimal movement patterns or like bracing strategies with like really gripping down through the rib cage in through there. Kind of along the same lines, and I won't get into this one too much, but that sort of similar along the same lines is you still hear that cue of like suck your belly button to your spine being used. And again, like a lot with younger dancers, it's a cue that I think gets used, with sort of like younger dance ages. And for very similar reasons to the knitting your ribs together cue, that is not a great cue to be using with dancers. I would say in my experience, that cue got used a lot when I was a kid. Like I remember that cue so vividly, but I don't hear it being used as much. I do think a lot of teachers have moved away from that like belly button to spine cue, but there are still teachers who are using it. And for very similar reasons to the knitting your ribs together cue, it is definitely one we want to try and move away from because it's not creating the sort of movement strategies or movement muscle recruitment that we're actually looking for, if what we're looking for is trying to sort of promote sort of a neutral spinal alignment. And finally, number 5, the final cue, and that we want to stop using as dance teachers or in the dance world. And this one, I had many iterations of people sending me in this one. So this is the idea or this cue of pulling up or pull up, or don't sit in your hips, or pull up out of your hip socket. There were lots of different iterations of this cue. And again, there's a few reasons why this cue is potentially problematic. And one of them is just that it's like so vague. What does that cue even mean? Pull up what? Pull up from where? Pull up how? It doesn't give a dancer any information about what it is you actually want them to be doing. And I think this cue gets used not just for pulling up out of the hip, but just in general, this cue gets used. But the one that I got most often was like these cues of don't sit in your hip, don't sink in your hip, pull up out of your hip, all of that type of stuff. So I think I'm going to talk about that one a little bit. So with that cue, excuse me, the reason that teachers are using that cue is often that dancers aren't maintaining a level pelvis, especially if they're working on single leg type things. So if we are standing on 2 feet, we ideally want our pelvis to be sort of like horizontal or level to the ground. And if we transfer our weight over onto one leg or the other leg, what we'll often see is one side of the pelvis kind of like drops down. And so the pelvis is no longer horizontal. It's sort of on a little bit of an angle. And in like technical terms, this is called a Trendelenburg. It's one of the things that you'll sometimes actually even see if people are like walking down the street. Every time they take a step, their pelvis sort of tilts from side to side. And this is often what teachers are referring to when they talk about not sinking into the hip or pulling up out of the hip. But again, this cue doesn't give dancers information about how they're actually meant to try and solve this problem or what they're meant to be like recruiting. And when you give this cue pull up, you'll see dancers do all sorts of things in their body. Like you'll see things activate in their leg or in their trunk or in their head, or all of a sudden their shoulders are up near their ears, or, you get all of these strategies they're trying to utilize because this cue just doesn't mean a lot to them or doesn't make any sense. So if we're thinking about keeping that pelvis level and that sort of Trendelenburg or the sinking in their hips and pulling up out of their hips or whatever you want to call that, really we want to be cueing them much more locally to that area. And I don't just mean pull up out of your hip, but really teaching them the anatomy to know that the muscles that are going to help us stabilize through our hip and through our pelvis are the muscles on the outside of our hips. So we often just refer to them as our like lateral hip muscles. And if we're not engaging those muscles, then we're going to get this kind of dropping that happens in our pelvis, or this like relative Trendelenburg that happens. And so we want dancers to learn how to engage and stabilize through their lateral hip muscles to be able to maintain that level pelvis position. But just kind of using this very vague cue of pull up doesn't often get what we're looking for. Because like I said, we'll see them, pull their shoulders up by their ears or pull their rib cage up or like do all of these things that aren't actually what we're looking for. So we really need to teach dancers where their lateral hip stabilizers are, and also how to recruit those muscles, how to switch those muscles on to be able to keep their pelvis level as they're, say, transferring weight from one leg to the other, or doing something prolonged on one leg. We see it a lot, like at the bar where, if you're doing a long, fondue and grand rond de jambe or something exercise at the bar, dancers will start to fatigue. So they'll start to kind of let their pelvis drop a little bit. And then teachers will be like, pull up, pull up, pull up. But really, we want to really work on them recruiting those stabilizers in through like the lateral hip muscles so that we don't see that drop happening. So, alternatives for this, like I said, like external cueing is often better than internal cueing for performance outcomes and things like that. But I think this is a case where we could potentially use an internal cue and really cue the alignment of their pelvis rather than this idea of pulling up, because again, like they don't know where that pulling up is coming from. So there's many, many ways of sort of changing this cue and getting the desired results that we want. But this idea of pulling up is really a cue that is not at all useful to dancers. And they are often incredibly confused by it and really don't know like what they're meant to be activating or where they're meant to be pulling up from. So I would challenge you to find an alternate cue that is either more anatomically specific or maybe using more like landmarks or visual landmarks of, like I said, like pelvis alignment or something like that, or finding an external cue. So again, if we think about external cueing, so it's cues that are not related to the body, maybe the cue becomes, press into the floor to activate like the outer hip muscles. And you wouldn't say to activate the outer hip muscles, but you can play around with and come up with cues that might work for that dancer that are external to them. So whether that's, things like oftentimes we'll use directional things within the room, like reach for the wall or press into the floor or press down or things like that, that aren't actually like an anatomical cue within their body. So I would encourage you or challenge you to really think about those cues and how you're using them and whether there are alternatives that you could be using instead that maybe are a little bit more clear to the dancers or at least not anatomically incorrect. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Those are 5 cues that I would challenge everybody in the dance world to stop using because, like I said, they create problematic movement patterns or are just anatomically incorrect. And I really think that dance teachers are absolute experts at visualization and creating sort of visuals that dancers can use to achieve the lines that we want or like the activation we want and things like that. And so it is time to get rid of these old, outdated cues that are really not serving us within the dance world. I would love to hear your thoughts and comments. If there are other cues that are your like pet peeves or ones that you're just like, we need to stop using these, send me a message. Let me know. These conversations are so fun to have because I think there's also slight like geographical differences of how the cues are used in various areas of the world. And it's so cool to see, how different cues are used within different geographical areas. So send me a message. You can reach me on social media at Dance Physio Erika, or my email is in the show notes. And I would love to hear how you are changing up your cueing and potentially not using some of these cues now that you know that they are problematic. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your support, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.